Hi, guys. We're going to read the last few pages of Chapter 4, Listening and Evaluating. In these last few pages, we're going to learn about how we can evaluate what a speaker says, whether his reasoning is logical. We're also going to learn about propaganda techniques. I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with propaganda. And finally, we're going to learn how to give written and oral critiques. And that's the last part of the chapter. Now, you can access the chapter through the lesson plans and get to this PDF. We're going to start on page 90 of the PDF. And or it's really page 10 of the PDF, but it's 90 in the book. We're also going to make sure that we have the PowerPoint available so we can do some review, right? And we're on slide 11. So in this first portion, we evaluate what a speaker says to us and whether what he says is reasonable. And it says an important part of being an effective listener is evaluating a speaker's reasoning or their logical thinking. So you have to ask yourself if the speaker is using faulty reasoning. And faulty reasoning might sound like a contradiction, but it's really kind of common. Statements that seem like they're reasonable, even well-reasoned, right? They often are based, though, on mistakes in logic. So good listeners know that even when you've got supporting details that are precise and accurate, that you have to draw logical conclusions. And if the conclusions that are drawn between the evidence and the conclusion are illogical, well, there must be some faulty reasoning there. Now, as a good listener, you should be able to recognize different types of faulty reasoning. The first one is called hasty generalizations. And just like hasty means, it means too quick. A generalization is when you come to a broad conclusion or an opinion based on just a few observations, but you go too quickly, you jump the gun, and you've made a broad conclusion. And it says a valid generalization is based on a sufficient amount of evidence. And then when you do make that conclusion, you usually say, well, in some cases, in most cases, or generally, because this isn't scientific, folks. Okay. A hasty generalization, or one that's too fast, is when you jump to a conclusion, but you've not observed very many times and you ignore other cases. So the example in the book says, you see John, he turns in his paper late today, and then a classmate might make this hasty generalization that John never turns his work in on time. But if you analyze this further, today might have been the only time that John turned in his paper late. Based on this one conclusion, you see your classmate says, look at him. He's always late, or he's lazy or something, right? That's a bad conclusion based on a single incident. So let's take a look at the PowerPoint so we can review that concept. Once again, it's very important that we know a speaker's reasoning or their logical thinking. Some speakers say things, but they might be based on mistakes in logic. That's called faulty reasoning. And those mistakes in logic often come from false premises that aren't true, or they're distorted. Here's the example of a hasty generalization. A bike rider gets nearly run off the road by a driver from Ohio, okay, with Ohio license plates. And that bike rider says, all Ohio drivers are rude, just because he's had that one incident, right? We've heard about that, right? Indiana drivers, they're always bad drivers, stuff like that. Okay. The next type of faulty reasoning is called begging the question. Now, just like the name of it states, it's almost like you have to ask a question in order to dig more deeply and tell whether this person is being honest. So it says begging the question means assuming the truth of a statement even before it's been proven. But listeners have to be careful to see that the speakers have actually proven that what they've claimed is a fact. So the example in the book says, a speaker says, with my plan, this country's failed and ineffective health system can be remedied within a decade. Well, we have to look at it more closely, and that's the analysis. The speaker has given no proof that the country's healthcare system is an ineffective failure. And even more so, it begs the question, what is your plan? You said with your plan, you're going to remedy the healthcare system within a decade. You've given me no evidence at all. So this is when someone makes a big, broad statement that it's going to be a fact, but you've not given me any evidence. So it begs the question, where's the evidence? Next section. It's a false premise. Now we're going to look at the PowerPoint here in just a moment because I've got a good example. But a false premise is stated or an implied starting point for an argument, and this is implied that it's true. A false premise is one that's not true. So here's a great example. I think you're going to get it. It says, you know what? We're bound to have a winning team this year. 5 of our starters are back. But this statement is built on a premise or an assumption that just because you have experience, that you have skill, and that you're going to be successful. But this isn't necessarily true because those 5 returning players might have been mediocre in the first place. So it doesn't necessarily logically connect that you're going to win the championship or whatever, right? So let's take a look. Begging the question, the example that I have here says that, and we'll kind of move this out of your way, means accepting the truth of a statement before it's proven. Like if you were to hear, this restaurant serves the best food because the chef is the best French chef, but the speaker has given no proof that the food is the best or that the chef is the best, right? So it begs the question, how can you prove that to me? The next one about a false premise is kind of silly, but I think you will understand. Again, it's an implied starting point for an argument that's untrue or even distorted. And this one's ridiculous, but I think you'll get it. It says, we haven't been hit by any enormous meteorites in thousands of years, so NASA must be doing something right. So the premise is that NASA is doing something to prevent the meteors from hitting the planet. But of course, that's not true, right? There's a premise there. Here's another silly one. My desk keeps tigers away. You don't see any tigers around, do you? That's for all of you Tiger King lovers out there. That's a really ridiculous one, that the premise is that your desk somehow prevents something from happening, okay? Just ridiculous, very silly examples. But just to help you understand that a premise is an assumption that we can't always accept as fact. All right, back to our book. An analogy. Everybody out here knows that analogies are comparisons. A good analogy is going to draw a valid conclusion from 2 items that can be logically compared, kind of like this, like that my eyeballs are a little bit like a camera where I can look around and take a picture with my eyes and the picture goes into my mind, right? That could be a pretty decent comparison. But a false analogy is between 2 things that really can't be logically compared, or they're just too weak and they're far-fetched. So the example here is that a band member, let's say somebody in the RHS band, says to a friend, gee, I wish that you had learned how to play the saxophone so you could join the marching band with us. Since you play the violin so well, I'm sure you could learn the saxophone really easily. But if you analyze and you look further, it says the speaker's reasoning is based on a false analogy. Just because you play the violin well doesn't necessarily ensure that you're going to be able to play the saxophone well, because these instruments are so different and they require different skills. Okay, so let's go ahead and turn the page to irrelevant evidence, but I want to show you on my PowerPoint what it says for a false analogy. Again, the review is it's a form of reasoning by comparing, and that it draws invalid conclusions from weak or far-fetched comparisons, like this one. Children are like dogs. They need to be strongly disciplined and housebroken. But that's a bad comparison, bad analogy, because we don't put our children on leashes. I hope not. They don't drink from bowls. They don't see the vet. It's not a good comparison. It's just a false analogy. Okay. Now we're on to irrelevant evidence. Irrelevant evidence is when someone gives you something that sounds really strong. It sounds like strong data, strong support, but what they're trying to claim, the support does not match. Okay, so irrelevant evidence is information that has nothing to do with the argument being made. The evidence sounds impressive, but unless it's related, then you've got, again, a mistake in logic. So the example in the book says, The merchandise at the Ultra store is top quality, and the manager has clothes shipped in from all over the world. But we know that it doesn't matter if he's gotten clothes from all over the world. How do we know those are top quality clothes? So you haven't given me any good evidence to support that. So let's go ahead and move on. The next portion of the chapter is examining propaganda techniques, and I'll go ahead and move down in my PowerPoint too. Boy, oh boy, propaganda. I hope that you've all learned something already about propaganda when you study history, especially when you've learned about, the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler or even North Korea. There are so many examples in our world when leaders have used an abundance of propaganda techniques in order to coerce people into thinking or believing a certain way. But we've got to make a difference here, a difference between persuasion. So let's read. It says, persuasion is the attempt to convince others to do something or to change their belief based on their own free will. So here's an example. I would really hope that you all are recycling during this COVID-19 crisis, that when you drink out of a plastic container, you put it in the plastic recycling. Or if you use an aluminum can, you put it in the aluminum recycling. That way, those items can be broken down and reformed into something else that's useful on the planet. Now, this is up to you. It's your own free will. It's your life. You're going to do what you want to. Hopefully, you're thinking about yourself, your future, and the planet. But propaganda, guys, is not that type of persuasion. Propaganda is so prevalent in a society that what it does is it pushes out your ability to think for yourself. So let's look at the book. It says propaganda is a persuasion that deliberately discourages people for thinking for themselves. And because its sole purpose is to spread information and claims that further or destroy a cause or an idea or a product or even a person, propaganda at its very worst, relies on one-sided or distorted arguments. And typically when I am in my classroom and I am showing examples of propaganda, what I really like to do is show you propaganda posters, but I won't show you all of them. You can do that on your own. But let's look here first. It says persuasion also heavily relies on emotional appeals. Like when I was saying, "Oh, I hope you're thinking about the planet," right? I mean, I'm not trying to be sappy here, but which attempt to sway people through feelings, but not necessarily logic. And emotional appeals are perfectly acceptable in persuasion. And in fact, they're very important. But when emotional appeals ignore logic or ignore reason, then they become a propaganda device. So if you see that, you should definitely think, well, they are really trying to pull at my heartstrings and they're not using logic to get me to think for myself. So a good listener closely examines any persuasive statement to identify the propaganda techniques. Now, let's start first with some propaganda posters, okay? So I'll get my glasses on so I can see this a little bit better, and on your screen, you should see it just fine. So I thought for today I would Google propaganda posters. You can do that yourself. Often I will show propaganda posters, and immediately what comes up is sometimes good posters, sometimes maybe not so good. I think they're okay, but sometimes not so good. This one here, like, I want you for the U.S. Army. We have all seen this poster with Uncle Sam on it, and he's pointing right at the viewer, and he's trying to convince you to join the Army, right? During times of war, there's a need for soldiers. And so these posters would be everywhere, and there was a pressure in society that you should join the military, right? So we see it all over, but that's a bit of propaganda. The other one is showing a woman in rolled up sleeves. We've all seen this, an incredibly famous poster, and it says, "We can do it." These were posters designed to encourage women to leave their homes, caring for children, wearing dresses, cooking and cleaning, and join the forces in the factories to help build planes and munitions, right? We've all seen that. But propaganda can be very prevalent in a society to the point where you don't think for yourself, and it can be very ugly. Like, for example, if you look up North Korean propaganda, you will often see anti-American images showing that Americans are very evil. Or if you look up Third Reich propaganda posters, you'll often see that Hitler and his disciples, his followers, they believed that only if you looked a certain way were you acceptable. Only if especially there was a hatred of Jewish people. I absolutely despise those, but they would over exaggerate the look of people that were different from those people that they accepted. So those people that were accepted were often fair-skinned, fair-haired, blue-eyed. Unacceptable was large-nosed, dark-skinned, dark eyes. And they would just make Jewish people not only look evil, but they would portray them as evil. Now, Soviet propaganda posters, I can go ahead and show you here, with some bit of safety, but often this propaganda was to show that if you join the workforce, if you join the proletariat, it was called, the working class, then you will eventually get back to you what you deserve, right? If you put into the work, you're going to get back something, and we will all share in the workload. But it didn't work out too well for the Soviets, right? So there's a lot of Soviet propaganda. Here's a Soviet space propaganda poster saying that we're better at space travel. Okay, now let's go back to the book. You should be in your book on page 93. This first bit of propaganda is called transfer. Now, transfer is when you connect things that aren't connected at all. Like in advertising, this connection is built on a product and then you having some good outcome or a positive value. But good listeners, they demand that there's a link and that these are supported by evidence. Now, I'm going to show you here one bit of transfer. Let me go to that slide. Is Pepsi. Oh, Pepsi did a lot of transfer type propaganda that you could see that in the old Pepsi commercials. Pepsi always had commercials where it was young, hip people, and they were part of the new generation, whereas Coca-Cola was supposed to be like the older classic generation, like old people. So you try to transfer that you're going to be happy and young and hip with the product, that if you drink Pepsi, that you're going to have that as a result, right? The next one is called the bandwagon. Everybody in here has probably heard of jumping on the bandwagon, but this is where it's a propaganda technique where you encourage people to act, but only because everybody else is doing it. And it attempts to substitute peer or crowd pressure for analysis of an issue or an action. So good listeners insist that the speaker gives support for the call to action. Now, I would have to say that in our study of Abraham Lincoln, when we learned that his son Robert wanted to join the cause to fight for the Union, that there was a lot of that feeling of bandwagon, that people should act because everybody else is doing it, right? If you see the whole world is and you show up and you don't have a uniform on, oh goodness, So in my PowerPoint, it says joining the war, enlisting because others are doing it too. All right, we can see name calling is coming up. So name calling is just like what you think it is. You label people. It arouses powerful negative feelings. You present a particular group in often a very bad way, but good listeners look beyond labels and they look for evidence. So it says here in your book, I'm going to increase the size just a little bit. It says a candidate might ask you to vote against another candidate because that candidate is a warmonger or a tree hugger like a hippie, or you can be a preppy or an egghead. On my PowerPoint, I have some other examples, right? You can be a commie, you can be a fascist, a yuppie, a preppy, a jock. I mean, all of those things apply. So, think of it that way. The next one is called card stacking. And just like it sounds, you're trying to stack some evidence and make it seem impressive, but it's really based on just inaccurate evidence or half truths. So it only presents part of the information, and the rest of the stack is basically empty, if that makes sense to you. It says it presents only partial information in order to leave an inaccurate impression. All effective speakers emphasize that information that supports their viewpoint. Good listeners withhold judgment until they hear the supporting details for the case for their side. So it says a speaker might refer to a person who has amassed a fortune through intimidation and illegal means as a good breadwinner. But this phrase only tells part of the story, since it ignores the negative methods that the person used to become the good breadwinner. Wow, you've become so rich, but where's the rest of the cards, right? How'd you get the money? All right. The next one is easy for us to all get. We've heard of stereotypes. It's a biased belief of a whole group of people, and it's again based on insufficient or irrelevant evidence. A stereotype ignores individuals. Good listeners reject stereotypes. They demand specific information. So in the book, it says a coworker might say, surely you don't plan to discuss the issue with the president of the company. Presidents are too interested in profit and personal gain to care about the problems of a single employee. But upon closer analysis, that doesn't mean all presidents of a company are stereotypically just looking for profits. In your PowerPoint, if you move ahead past those other examples for card stacking, a stereotype, again, it says based on a belief about a whole group of people. Like maybe here's one you could get, all women are bad drivers, something like that. Just a stereotype. It's not good at all. Okay, loaded words are just the way that those sound too, that you've got words that draw out strong, either positive or negative feelings. There's a lot of connotation behind it. In other words, feelings or associations, and they create bias. So if you look at the example here in the book, it says, in discussing assertive behavior, Nan describes herself as confident, but Chris as pushy and Rita as a braggart. Although the behavior described is exactly the same, the use of these loaded words makes Nan's behavior seem positive, because look at the difference. You can be confident, but if you're confident, sometimes you are needing to be pushy. Maybe you're confident in yourself, so you say good things about yourself, but does that mean you're a braggart? You see how some of those words seem to be loaded and make you seem it's more negative than the others. And then finally, we've got emotional appeals, but let me go back here. Loaded words. I've got to move on past that. Emotional appeals. Oh, wow, folks. You can use statements to coerce people and get them to change their behavior. If they're very emotional, they're good at persuading. But however, it says emotional appeals distort the truth or provoke irrational desires and fears, and they become propaganda techniques. I'd have to say that I've seen a little bit of negative emotional appeal in this COVID-19, where we use racist terms to make it seem like the Chinese were doing this on purpose, that this flu was something to hurt Americans. That to me is an emotional appeal because it gets us really riled up. But a better example would be that when we see commercials for the Humane Society, they arouse our emotions. We see these dogs in terrible situations and we want to help, right? But is it based on logic? So it says, to gain support for the local Humane Society, a speaker might tell a moving story about the disposal of animals because of limited resources. People who want to help animals would probably respond emotionally to these specific examples. But is it the right thing to do? The last part of the chapter is all about how we can give a critique. It's called listening and evaluating, but it's asking us that if we hear a speaker present a speech, we can give a critique, and that's what I do when I hear your speeches. A critique is an analysis or an evaluation. Oral critiques are just the way they sound. They're just done, given out loud. They provide you with a little bit of instant feedback. So, was your eye contact good? How was your information? Could we hear you? That type of thing. Do we need to maybe change the melody in our voices? So it says how to give an oral critique. We give some positive feedback because everybody needs that. What are one or two things that the speaker did very well? Number two, when we do have to give a little bit of negative feedback, remember to concentrate on just a couple of criticisms and make it productive, make it constructive. And when you make those criticisms, you have to tell them how they can improve it. And you're very specific. Last thing is be specific. What did they do well and what can they do to make it better? The written critique is what I do for you guys all of the time. Your speeches are broken down into lots of categories, everything from how you use language to how you've organized and everything in between. So it's really more complete. It's a good way to help you to develop and help your speeches right along. Now, in the book, it gives us a couple of tips on how to do that. So number one is think about the organization of the speech. Do all of the parts fit together? Do you have a beginning, a middle, and an end? What's the content? Number two, was it specific to the audience? Were your ideas really supported? Number three, the language that you used, did it help or did it hurt? Were you confusing? And number four, comment on the delivery. Remember, this is about your voice, your mannerisms, things like that. So that's it for chapter 4, listening and evaluating. You can always use the PDF to review and help to answer the questions that you'll find on Google Classroom. There's also a place at the end of the PDF where you can examine different types of propaganda techniques and see how well you did, guys. But that's it for today's video. Signing off. See you next time.